Good day. 24 hours after the major Russian missile strike on Ukraine, we're now getting more and more information both about the amount of damage that was done and about the type of targets that the Russians were attacking. The Russians, first of all, have now provided their own account of this missile strike. When I say the Russians, I mean by that the Russian Ministry of Defense. And you can find it in their briefing. This is the briefing that they provided yesterday, summing up the events of the previous week in the area of the special military operation. Anyway, this is what the Russian Defense Ministry has to say about this big missile strike on Ukraine. In the period from 23rd to 29th December 2023, the armed forces of the Russian Federation inflicted 50 group strikes and one mass strike with high-precision weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles on the military-industrial facilities, military aircraft infrastructure, arsenals, storage sites for artillery ammunition, uncrewed surface vehicles, weapons and military hardware, as well as enemy POL, P-O-L, not quite sure what that means, POL bases. In addition, the locations of Ukrainian military units, nationalist formations, and foreign mercenaries were hit. All the assigned targets have been engaged. Now that is a typical Russian Defense Ministry statement about what the Russian Defense Ministry was up to. It is terse and very short, but it does provide us with some understanding of the purpose of this missile strike. It was not, notice, directed at Ukraine's energy system. It was primarily directed at military industrial facilities, in other words, at the Ukrainian armaments industry, which Ukraine has been trying to revive. The Ukrainian armaments industry was devastated by Russian missile strikes in the first weeks of the war. But in the last few months, the Ukrainians have tried to get it back into some forms of production, and they've been trying to attract partnership deals with West European manufacturers, Rheinmetall, for example. But anyway, the Russians have struck at the factories again, but they've also, according to the Russians, struck at military airfield infrastructure, arsenals, storage sites for artillery ammunition, uncrewed surface vehicles, weapons and military hardware, and POL bases, as well as the locations of Ukrainian army units, nationalist formations, and foreign mercenaries. So, primarily, a missile strike focused on Ukraine's military-industrial complex, which, as I said, Ukraine is trying to revive, and other parts of Ukraine's military infrastructure. And we've now had a very detailed report about the strike from Strana, which has, this is of course this dissident Ukrainian website. I believe it's published in Europe now, not in Ukraine itself. But they've provided also their own account of what happened, based presumably on Ukrainian sources, and in fact it matches up very closely to what the Russian Defense Ministry has said. So Strana reported in this way: today the Russians launched their first massive missile strike on Ukraine in a long time. Many regional centers and the capital Kiev fell under it. We collected the main facts about the massive attack. The attack was spaced out over time and combined. In the evening and at night, Shaheds, That's, of course, the Iranian name for the Uranium-2 drones. And ballistic missiles flew. I'm not sure they were ballistic missiles, actually. My understanding is that they were primarily cruise missiles. But anyway, aircraft missile strikes began in the morning. In total, 122 missiles and 36 Shaheeds, in other words, uranium-2s, were fired across Ukraine. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, they managed to shoot down 87 missiles and 27 drones. In total, out of 158 air targets, 114 were shot down, as reported by Commander-in-Chief Zelensky. All destroyed missiles were KH-101, KH-555 and KH-55 models, which are launched from strategic bombers. Those missiles that failed to be shot down were the KH-2232, also launched from long-range bombers, actually Tupolev 22 and 3 bombers, 5 Kinzhals that were launched from near Astrakhan, 4 KH-31P anti-aircraft missiles, and 1 KH-59 aircraft missile. Now, the KH-31s and the KH-59s would be launched principally by the Sukhoi 34s, the fighter bombers, the Sukhoi 35s, and the Sukhoi 57 fifth generation aircraft are also capable of shooting down these kinds of missiles. And then Strana goes on to say it was not possible to shoot down the S-300, 400 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, only 14 units. Now, they're implying here that the Russians launched air defense missiles, S-300 and S-400 air defense missiles, converted to some kind of ground attack capability alongside Iskander-M ballistic missiles. I don't believe that the Russians use either S-300s, and certainly they don't use the very valuable and expensive S-400 missiles for this kind of purpose. For the record, I believe that all ballistic missiles that the Russians might have launched over the course of this missile strike would almost certainly have been Iskander-Ms. Anyway, apparently only 14 of these missiles were launched, and the Ukrainians were unable to shoot down any one of them. Now, this is important because if out of all of these missiles, the Ukrainians are unable to shoot down Kinzhals, were unable to shoot down Kinzhals, KH-2232 type missiles, or ballistic missiles, then that, to my mind, again calls into doubt repeated Ukrainian claims that have been made many times over the course of the last couple of months, and which have been repeated by various Western commentators, that the Ukrainians have been successful shooting down Kinzhal missiles, specifically with their Patriot air defense systems. And Yuri Ignat, the official who speaks for Ukraine's air defense command, has now again come forward and said that never at any point in this conflict has Ukraine successfully managed to shoot down a KH-2232 missile, the missiles launched by the Tupolev 22 M3s. Now, I've discussed this missile in the past. It is an absolutely enormous supersonic cruise missile launched by these medium bombers. It was originally developed in the 1960s in order to attack US Navy carriers. The Russians have kept updating it ever since. In its latest iteration, the KH-32, it It has a more advanced engine and, of course, entirely new electronic and radar components, but it remains a very high-speed supersonic missile. Now, if Ukraine is incapable of shooting down a huge supersonic ballistic missile, how is it managing to shoot down a much smaller, though still sizable, but very, very much faster Kinjal hypersonic missile that flies perhaps twice as fast? It doesn't make any kind of sense to me. I've made this point before. Ignat himself, in the past, before he was corrected by the Ukrainian government, denied that the Ukrainians were successfully shooting down Kinjal missiles. The Russians themselves insist that Ukraine has never successfully intercepted a Kinjal missile. And on this one issue, I firmly believe the Russians, until and unless the Ukrainians can provide some real proof, something they have never managed to do up to this point, that they're successfully shooting down Kinjal missiles with their Patriot interceptors, I will maintain my deep, extreme skepticism about this claim. Anyway, there we go. That is what Strana tells us about the missiles that we used in this attack. Now, they say that the missiles, the bulk of the missiles that were shot down, well, all of the missiles that were shot down were the KH-101 subsonic cruise missiles that the Russians launch from their strategic bombers. They're Tupolev 95 bombers, which operate, by the way, over Russian airspace, though interestingly, they're now being given fighter escorts. Now, this reference, this breakdown from Strana does not mention the Calibre subsonic bombers, subsonic cruise missiles, which were also launched by the Black Sea Fleet. They were launched by ships from the Black Sea Fleet, and they undoubtedly were also participating in this cruise missile attack. Now, the KH-101 and the Calibre are, in some respects, similar missiles. They're both subsonic, long-range missiles. They are also, however, entirely different missiles. And my understanding is that the Calibre is non-stealthy, whereas the KH-101 is a stealthy cruise missile, which means that the KH-101 ought to be easier to shoot down than, more difficult to shoot down than the Calibre. So I'm guessing that to the extent that live missiles were shot down by Ukraine, those would have been mostly Calibre missiles rather than KH-101s. That's a guess. Now, the Ukrainians also, Strana also refers to KH-555, KH-55 models. As I understand it, these are variants of the KH-101. The KH-55 perhaps is an older version of this missile going back to Soviet times. The Russians have used it as a decoy missile. And the KH-101 missile itself now launches small needle-type missiles whilst it's travelling towards its targets, and these also operate apparently as decoys. Now, I mention this because I remember many months ago a Russian military official actually give an interview to the TASS news agency in which he said that the Ukrainians repeatedly report that they're shooting down more missiles than the Russians actually launch in any one particular strike. And he explained that by the fact that what the Ukrainians are actually shooting down is decoys rather than missiles themselves. Well, how would I know one way or the other? But just saying, that was what, as I said, a Russian official said over the course of an interview he gave to the TASS news agency. Returning to the article by Strana, they confirm that the main target were military-industrial facilities. And they say that 21 people were killed throughout the country and that the number of people wounded is 80. There were deaths in Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk, as the Russians call it, Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Lvov. And the main arrivals were in Kiev, Sviatoshinsky, Podolsky, and in Kiev, in the Sviatoshinsky, Podolsky, and Shevchenkovsky districts. And again, it seems that it was military industrial facilities that were attacked. In the Shevchenkovsky district, a warehouse, a business center, and apparently a metro station was hit, but that's next to the Artyom military plant, which was already shelled, which was also shelled. And there was also attacks upon military industrial facilities in Podolsk, a warehouse there. In Dnipro, where a shopping center and a maternity hospital were damaged. And by the way, this has been widely reported in the media in the West. The Russians, of course, again claim that this was debris from air defense missiles that have missed their targets. That may be true. That might not be true. Again, I'm not going to get into discussions about that. But Strana again suggests that the missiles were heading in Dnipro towards a nearby machine building plant, and there was also similar attacks on plants in Lvov and Odessa. And overall, the general picture again is of an attempt by the Russians to do damage to Ukraine's military-industrial complex. And judging by the number of targets hit, I think that substantially more missiles got through than General Zelensky and the Ukrainian General Staff are saying. Now, it's universally expected that this is going to be only the first such missile strike that we're going to see over the course of the next few weeks. There will be many more. My own view remains that the primary target of this missile strike, apart from these military-industrial facilities, was the Ukrainian air defense system itself, which the Russians are now working to degrade and destroy, firstly by exhausting the number of air defense missiles that the Ukrainians have, obliging the Ukrainians to expend missiles, trying to bring down these Russian missiles. And of course, if what the Ukrainians are actually hitting are just decoys, that works perfectly according to this plan. And also, the Russians do seem to be hunting to try to destroy Ukrainian air defense systems, to actually physically destroy them as well. And the Russian Defense Ministry here has now provided us with some information about air defense systems, Ukrainian air defense systems, which they claim to have destroyed over the course of the last week. And again, I'm taking this from the Russian Ministry of Defense website. They say that operational, tactical and missile troops of the Russian group forces eliminated combat vehicles of air defence systems, namely one Norwegian-made NASAMS, one German-made Iris-T, one French-made Crotale NG, one S-300 air defence system, and 3 US-made AN TPQ-50 counter-battery warfare radar systems. Now, there are also reports which notice that they are not included in these Russian Defense Ministry claims, but they're being widely reported, and they may be true, that the Russians hunted and destroyed a complete Patriot missile system, batteries, radars, and all the rest at a railway station in Kherson region. Supposedly, this was the Patriot system that the Ukrainians deployed to Kherson region in order to shoot down that Sukhoi 34, or those 3 Sukhoi 34s, or those 5 Sukhoi 34s that the Ukrainians claim to have shot down. The Russian Defense Ministry has never corroborated any one of these claims, and we have only seen photographic evidence of one aircraft shot down. But anyway, there are rumours, and I think rumours perhaps a better word than even reports. There are rumours that an entire Patriot system, the Patriot system that was used to carry out these attacks, has been destroyed in this railway station. And if not an entire system, at least critically important component parts of it. So presumably the Ukrainians moved the system to Kherson region to try to support their forces in Krinky. They shot down 1, 3, 5, 10 Russian aircraft with it. The Russians then came out hunting for it, and the Russians caught it at this railway station as it was being on the verge of being moved away, and they either massively damaged it or they destroyed it. Now, if these rumours are true, and I'm not sure that they are, by the way, but if these rumours are true, then whatever the Ukrainians did achieve over the course of their deployment of this Patriot system to Kherson region would have been a bad trade. The Russians are able to replace their aircraft losses. The Americans are finding it very, very difficult to keep Ukraine supplied with Patriot missiles and Patriot missile systems. And if it is indeed the case that an entire Patriot missile system has been destroyed, or even if some parts of it have been destroyed, then I doubt that the Americans are happy. In fact, I am sure that they are not. A PR win, like so many of Ukraine's PR wins, will have degraded its overall capabilities. Anyway, that's, as I said, just a rumour at the moment. If there's any confirmation, obviously I will come back and I will discuss it further. So, a very impressive missile strike altogether. More coming, undoubtedly. And my overall sense, by the way, is that, if anything, the Ukrainian air defense system, the one that the West has provided, has stood up less well than the previous Soviet-era air defense system that Ukraine relied upon last winter. I get the sense that, in fact, more targets were hit and more missiles got through than was the case before. But that's just a sense, a feeling, and I might be completely wrong. Now, what else has been happening on the battlefronts? Well, the political duel between Zelensky and Zelensky continues, and Zelensky, in my opinion, has won a big trick. I mean, he's scored a significant PR win against Zelensky, and he's done that by travelling to Avdeyevka and visiting the men of the 110th Brigade who are defending Avdeyevka. And I think before we continue with that, can I just say that whatever one may think of Zelensky, this was a courageous thing to do. Avdeyevka is surrounded on three sides. The perimeter, as I have been saying, has been shrinking. And just a few days ago, I was talking about reports about how Ukrainian troops, 108 men who had been given Christmas leave and were leaving Avdeyevka in coaches, that there was reason to think that the Russians spotted these coaches and that the coaches were destroyed, and that all of those 108 soldiers were either killed or wounded, because it seems they never arrived to rejoin their families. And by the way, since I mentioned that, there have been more reports about this particular incident, and most of the reports appear to confirm that all of those soldiers were apparently killed, which is terrible if true. Well, given that incidents like that happen, given that it is a very high-risk thing to go to Avdeyevka at this time and to leave Avdeyevka, one has to say this about Zelensky: his decision to visit Avdeyevka did take courage, a lot of courage, and it will undoubtedly have been highly appreciated by the soldiers he visited. So he went to Avdeyevka, he met with the soldiers, he probably gave them some words of encouragement and support. He will have shown himself to them. They will have respected him for that. They will have felt that, he is prepared to take risks, to meet with them. And I would have thought that men involved in this kind of fight will strongly appreciate a move like this, an act like this. So Zelensky going to Avdeyevka will undoubtedly have boosted the morale of the soldiers, if only for a short time. And given the incident with the 108 men that have been apparently killed, that was both a timely thing to do and a brave one. But I suspect that, as with everything else that's now going on in Ukraine, there was a specific political purpose behind Zelensky's decision to go to Avdeyevka. And that is that just a few days ago, in comments which I found all but incomprehensible, General Zelensky came out and said that Avdeyevka is going to be captured by the Russians eventually. It might take the Russians 2 months or 3 months, but eventually Avdeyevka will indeed be theirs. And I said that I found that an astonishing thing for a commander to say, given that his troops are being placed in this impossibly difficult position of trying to defend this all but encircled town. And he's basically telling them, well, ultimately you're fighting a battle to retain control of a town, which we're going to lose to the Russians anyway. Now, I appreciate that there are people who are saying that Zelensky was explaining all of this, that it's important to hold on to Avdeyevka for as long as possible so that the great defense systems can be built in the rear. But I do wonder to what extent men on the front lines are going to be impressed by that kind of rationalization. But anyway, so that was what Zelensky said. He's telling the soldiers in Avdeyevka, you know, all this sacrifice, all this danger that you're putting yourselves through, ultimately it's all going to be for nothing because the Russians are going to capture the place. Well, along comes Zelensky, and he's giving, in effect, a completely different message. He's telling the soldiers, here I am, I'm 100% behind you, I'm coming myself, I'm putting myself at great personal risk. Sacrifice is not in vain, it is highly appreciated, and of course, by implication, Avdeyevka will hold. And of course, the last is in some respects an ominous sign, because by going to Avdeyevka, Zelensky is in effect giving a kind of personal commitment, a commitment on behalf of Ukraine, of which he remains president, that Avdeyevka will indeed be defended, notwithstanding what General Zelensky has said. So there we are. That was Zelensky's action. And as I said, it is a brave one. It is no doubt an inspiring one for the soldiers present in Avdeyevka itself, even cynical, hard-bitten, sceptical soldiers that they probably are. They will certainly appreciate his visits to them. But it's also, in a strange way, if one takes a step back and thinks about it, it's essentially a sentence. It is telling them that you're going to have to stay in Avdeyevka and go on fighting there, because we're not going to give this place up. And you've got the Russians on all sides, and the Russians are working now steadily towards cutting you off, but we're not going to allow you to withdraw. So that's Zelensky. And that, of course, now brings me to the situation on the battle lines in general. And again, it's the usual cascade of bad news for Ukraine. In Avdeyevka itself, in the fighting around Avdeyevka, lots of reports now of the Russians making still more gains. They're consolidating their gains north to the northwest of Avdeyevka along the railway, that they've continue to hold at least a part of Stepovoye, that they're clearing the fields and woods around Stepovoye of Ukrainian defenders, and also that they're making progress within the industrial zone to the north of Avdeyevka, at the places of the coke plant and the chemical factory, and all of these places that they're making more progress and that they're advancing faster there. And it's probably still some weeks before Avdeyevka does eventually fall, but as General Zelensky has in effect conceded, at some point fall it will do. Meanwhile, elsewhere on the battlefronts, in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, there is considerable anguish if you read Ukrainian channels, because the Russians are gradually regaining control of all the ground that Ukraine captured at such enormous cost during its summer offensive. Ground which, to my mind, is practically valueless anyway, and which it would make more sense for Ukraine to retreat from. But for the moment, at least, they're trying to defend their positions there, even though there are some reports that they're building fortified lines south of the town of Orechov, which was their main staging area during the summer offensive, which might suggest that eventually the Ukrainians do indeed intend to withdraw all the way back to Orechov, ceding all the gains, all the ground that they gained over the course of the summer offensive. And there's Ukrainian reports now, all of which coming together, basically saying that the Russians are coming very close to squeezing them completely out of the area of Rabotino, this small village, almost a hamlet, that was so bitterly fought over during the summer, where the Ukrainians claimed a famous, though as it turned out, ephemeral victory at the end of August when they said that they'd captured Rabotino. But anyway, whatever, it looks as if the Russians are in the process of regaining control, full control over Rabotino, over the high ground on which Rabotino is situated, and that they're clearing systematically the ground between Rabotino and Verbovoye. And the Ukrainians seem to accept that they're going to lose this territory as well. And elsewhere, there's more reports of the Russians now consolidating ground that they've captured near Bakhmut on the way to Chasiv Yar, and also making further advances in the Marinka area. There continues to be an intense battle for this village of Novomykhailovka, but it does look as if the Russians are now well on track to capturing this village as well. And to reiterate again, Avdeyevka, Marinka, Novomykhailovka, Vugleda, all of these places taken together create what might be called a unified defense system. If the loss of one part of it, Marinka, and perhaps following the fall of Avdeyevka, the loss of both parts of it, two parts of this defense system, compromises eventually the integrity of the whole. If Ukraine loses Avdeyevka as well as Marinka, and Zelensky has told us that it will, then eventually, ultimately, sooner or later, the Russians will have pushed the Ukrainians not just back from Donetsk city, but they will be well on the way to clearing the whole of the southern Donbass of Ukrainian forces, pushing the Ukrainians out of Vugleda as well, ultimately, no doubt, capturing the important town of Pokrovsk, and at that point, the battle in southern Donbass will have ended. And I would add also that the question of the security of the Russian land bridge to Crimea will, following that kind of win by the Russians, it would have been put beyond further doubt. If the Russians control all of southern Donetsk region, then I personally cannot see how it would be possible in the future for the Ukrainians to launch offensives from Zaporozhye region towards the Sea of Azov. They would have the Russians on their flanks, and to be frank about it, I think that you would probably at some point have to see a Ukrainian retreat in this area beyond the Dnieper River. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts in the south. There's lots of reports about more Russian advances now in the area of the Oskol River, and the Ukrainians claimed that there had been a major Russian attack on their positions in the village of Sinkovka near Kupiansk. The Ukrainians claimed that they managed to hold their positions in Sinkovka. The Russians are saying far less. But what we can see, again, is that the pressure from the Russians is accumulating, continues on every part of the front lines now. The Ukrainians being kept continuously busy, continuously obliged to feed more and more reinforcements, more and more men, units to try to hold the front line, and their army becoming exhausted. And in fact, there have been now increasingly desperate pleas from Ukraine towards the Western powers. The Ukrainians are apparently urgently pleading for a donor conference to be set up sometime in January. They're saying that unless they receive many more supplies from the West before very long, they will be unable to keep the front lines stable for much longer. In the past, they've talked about having to cede ground between the cities and to withdraw their forces to the cities as well. Now they're talking about even having to give up cities, towns, actual towns to the Russians, because they are becoming so critically short of men and supplies and artillery and machines. Well, that is no doubt true. I've no doubt that that is absolutely correct. But even as the Ukrainians tell the West this, that they're becoming desperately short of ammunition, especially, as well as men, they nonetheless have attempted to retaliate to this big Russian missile strike of the last of the previous 36 hours, the one that I discussed at the start of this program, by once again shelling Belgorod region and Belgorod city within Russia. It looks like some kind of retaliatory strike to this huge Russian missile strike. And again, I find the logic of this completely difficult, impossible in fact, to understand. Belgorod is indeed located very close to the border with Ukraine. Ukrainian positions, there are still Ukrainian troops close to the border. The Ukrainians in the summer, before the offensive began, launched cross-border raids into Belgorod, which went badly wrong, by the way. None of that has changed Russian strategies or tactics in any manner or fashion. The Ukrainians themselves now admit that they're critically short of ammunition, and yet they've taken this very strange decision to try to shell Belgorod city. And of course, they've done some damage. Some buildings have been damaged in Belgorod city. There's reports that people in Belgorod city have been killed. No doubt this is going to infuriate and annoy people in Russia. The Ukrainians might not be particularly concerned about that. But what is the military logic behind these strikes on Belgorod? If it's intended as some kind of retaliation to the Russian missile strike, well, all it does is it highlights the incredible imbalance of power now between the Ukrainians and the Russians, that the Russians are able to launch strikes in every single part of Ukraine with devastating and overwhelming force. The Ukrainians are limited to shelling Belgorod and doing a certain amount of damage to a number of buildings there. It doesn't equalize the damage. It merely highlights again how much more powerful the Russians are and how much more powerful they are becoming. But anyway, that is one thing that the Ukrainians are doing in response to all of this. And of course, they're pleading again for more Western support, more Western equipment and machines and supplies and all of those things. And they're starting now to hint that time for Ukraine is starting to run out. I noticed that one particular Ukrainian official who has been amongst the most hardline, which is Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, has now been talking about how the West is simply not geared or prepared for war. Obviously, the comparison he's making is with Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine and Russia geared for war, the West is not, and Kuleba clearly unimpressed with what the West has achieved. And one can sense behind these words a sentiment of disappointment and anger and ultimately even betrayal starting to find its way in. And of course, if one goes back to Zelensky's former spin doctor, Alexei Arestovich, he's become absolutely straightforward about this. He's now coming out and making extraordinary statements. By the way, he's not in Ukraine, which enables him now to make these statements. Anyway, he's making extraordinary statements about how the best thing for Ukraine is to change course entirely, ally itself with Russia, and basically turn on the West. And I would not be surprised if this betrayal narrative gradually does begin to gain increasing traction, and the experience of the war does indeed change sentiments in Ukraine, ultimately quite radically. Well, it must be said that not all Ukrainians are talking in this way. Mikhailo Podolyak, Zelensky's spokesman, says that the war will go on, that victory is certain for Ukraine. He said that the way the victory will end will be that Ukraine will announce an ultimatum to Russia, which the Russians will eventually have no choice but to capitulate to. Brave words? Some would say delusional words. I would say delusional words, given the realities on the battlefield. But anyway, that is what Podolyak said. And, of course, unsurprisingly, in the middle of the Russian missile strike, more reports about a Russian missile having strayed into Polish territory. The Russians are insisting that they need proof that it was indeed one of their missiles, which, given that the last time this allegation was made, it turned out that it wasn't. It turned out that it was a Ukrainian air defense missile. So one can understand why the Russians would be demanding that. The Poles admitting that they lost track of the missile once it was in flight, and wondering why that happened and why their air defense system was not able to keep track of this missile, unwilling for the moment, obviously, to provide whatever evidence they have to the Russians. This particular incident, it seems to me, is a relatively minor one, and to be straightforward about it, even if it was a Russian missile, I don't believe that anybody will seriously say that Article 5 of the Washington Treaty applies, and there's no sign that anybody in Poland, for the moment, is talking in that way. So, there we are. That is the situation in the war. There's been more information on the economic and industrial side in Russia, and one of the most interesting, and I suspect for Ukraine and for its Western backers, ominous signs, is that Russia's industrial PMI in December actually rose. This is despite the high interest rates. It went up from 53 to 54, I believe. The Russian industrial boom continues. All the indications are that Russian military industrial production is going to increase significantly less next year. The Rostec is saying that they will be supplying many more fighter jets to the Russian Air Force next year than they have this year. They're also saying that they've increased significantly production of Sukhoi 57 fighter jets for the Russian Air Force. And there was even a report in TASS, which I would take a little bit skeptically, that all the Sukhoi 57 fighter jets that the Rostec is going to supply to the Air Force next year are going to come with the new advanced Izdeliye 30 engine, which will apparently increase their capabilities significantly over the existing engine that they're currently using. Well, we shall see. But no sign of any slackening in Russian industrial and economic growth. For the record, I think what the increased interest rates that the central bank is enacting, I suspect what those interest rates are doing is that they're probably reducing economic activity in the construction, housing sectors, but that the result of all of that is that financing in the industrial sector is actually growing in order to compensate. So the central bank is lowering economic activity for the moment in areas of like construction and house building, and perhaps for purchases of big ticket items like cars, that there has apparently been a big revival in car buying in Russia, well, based on imports of Chinese cars, but also to some extent apparently increased production of Russian cars. But anyway, alongside that, probably more capital investment at lower interest rates into the manufacturing and industrial sector. Eventually, the high interest rates will start to weigh on the economy as a whole, and we will see growth slow next year from the extremely high rates that we're seeing now, and we'll probably start to see inflation begin to fall also. But for the moment, the industrial surge goes on, and there doesn't seem to be any end to that in sight. And again, I'm getting all these reports about the true scale of Russian arms production. I'm not going to say more about that in this program. Suffice to say that it is very high, and production of artillery ammunition does seem to be extremely high as well. Anyway, I want to just, before I proceed to other things, mention something further, which is that Glenn Deason and I were very privileged and very fortunate yesterday to do a program, have an interview, so a short 40-minute interview with Dmitry Polyansky. He is the Deputy Ambassador of Russia to the United Nations. And in fact, he was kind enough to grant us this interview just before, I understand, he was called to a meeting, an important meeting at the United Nations, perhaps even a meeting of the Security Council itself, though I don't know that for a fact. But anyway, he provided us with an awful lot of information. We are not going to publish this video on YouTube. We are conscious of YouTube's sensibilities and sensitivities about publishing videos with Russian officials, but you will be able to find the entire video on Locals and on Rumble when it appears, which I expect will be fairly soon. But anyway, for the record, I don't want to discuss all of the things that Ambassador Polyansky very kindly and generously told us. But he did talk about this vexed topic of negotiations. We had that article a couple of days ago in the New York Times saying that the Russian government, that President Putin was sending all these signals to the United States, to the West, that the Russians were interested in some kind of ceasefire or freezing of the conflict. Well, Ambassador Polyansky basically poured in a withering way a stream of cold water on all of those reports. He also told us that there was no diplomacy at all of any kind taking place in the Security Council amongst the between the Russian and American teams, in diplomatic teams of the Security Council, certainly not on the Ukrainian issues. And overall, the things that he said made both Glenn Deason and myself walk away confident that that story in the New York Times is factually wrong. And Ambassador Polyansky, of course, reminded us that President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has already contradicted that story. So I just wanted to say that, and I think that anyway, Ambassador Polyansky had a lot more things to say than just that. He also talked about the situation in Gaza, for example. He talked about many things. It was a relatively short interview. But to repeat again, you can find it all on our other platforms, the entire interview, when it comes out on our other app platforms. It will be out on our Rumble platform and our Locals platform. And as I said, we were privileged to have this from an actual official, an actual government official of the Russian Federation, a person who represents Russia at the United Nations. So that's what I'm going to say about the overall situation in the conflict in Ukraine today. Now, there remains perhaps the even more dangerous conflict in the Middle East. We have these American warships now in the Red Sea trying to protect the shipping there from the attack by the Houthis. This is a massively costly investment of equipment, of warships. In fact, these naval deployments to the Middle East, these huge naval deployments to the Middle East, must be massively expensive in themselves. And they're apparently continuing indefinitely. They must be burning through many billions of dollars of the Pentagon's budget. And there must be growing impatience in the United States with these deployments. The fact that such a huge part of the American military is tied down in the Middle East at this time. I suspect that many of the people who serve in the fleet, they must be also wondering what exactly it is that they're supposed to be doing there. And I'm afraid, I worry that this is probably adding ultimately to the overall momentum towards war. The situation in Gaza continues unresolved. Israel continues its military offensive there. Hamas, however, continues to resist. It's far from destroyed or defeated. There doesn't seem to be any clear timetable for Israel to achieve that sort of victory. And generally, the situation in the Middle East now looks like it is deteriorating again. I've seriously worry that once the new year is out of the way, we're going to see a significant resumption of the fighting in the Middle East and perhaps a larger war. And going back to the topic of Ukraine, I saw that the Biden administration has now authorized Israel to increase purchases of 155mm ammunition from the United States, which is going to reduce the already very limited pool of this ammunition for Ukraine even further. I think that whatever it is that the United States and its Western allies decide to do in the winter, seize Russian reserves, try and cobble together more supplies of Patriot missiles from Japan, anything of that kind. The reality is that the supply constraints are becoming overwhelming. And with Russian production now rising, the sooner this fact is acknowledged, the better it is for the United States and for the West, and ultimately for Ukraine itself. And the sooner it will be before political decisions, reality-based decisions, start to be made. Ukraine, to reiterate again, suffered a major defeat, a massive defeat in the summer over the course of its offensive. It lost a significant part of its army in that offensive and a lot of equipment that is irreplaceable. It is, in my opinion, as a military, mortally wounded. The West, through its long investment in Ukraine, has now reached the limits of what it can supply. These two facts need to be acknowledged now. The fact that Ukraine was defeated in the summer and that military-industrial constraints in the West have now become unresolvable, so that proper decisions can be made. They might require Western governments telling themselves and telling Ukraine that they have now reached the limit of what they can do, and of Ukraine telling itself in the new year that it has reached the limit of the amount of resistance it can sustainably continue to offer. If these realities are finally recognized, then there is finally a chance that proper decisions will be taken. Given that I doubt that the West will either openly acknowledge that it has reached its capacity limits, or that Ukraine will acknowledge that it suffered a massive military defeat in the summer, I'm afraid that we will have more magical decisions being made, more reckless steps being taken. And again, all I will say is that if you do listen to that interview with Ambassador Polyansky, you will see what he has to say about that. Well, thank you for joining me on this program today. I will be doing another program tomorrow, New Year's Eve. I do not anticipate at the moment that I will be doing a program on New Year's Day, but for the moment at least, this is where I finish. And can I remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X, links under of this video. You can also check out our shop and find all the amazing things that we have links under this video, and remember you can also buy things at discount in our Christmas sale. I believe the password or the message that you have to dial in is Christmas 2023. And of course you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video also. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.